Welcome to God's Lawyer Podcast. On this episode of The Brief, I want to try to answer the question, what is a worldview? We hear that word thrown around a lot, and I want to point out a great resource for you when trying to answer this question. The Universe Next Door by James Sire was a book I was introduced to probably about 15 years ago or so. And in this book, he helps us understand a worldview by, first of all, defining it, and then simplifies an analysis of worldviews by offering 7 questions. You say, why is this important? Because everyone has a worldview. Everyone. It doesn't matter. An atheist, a theist, a Christian, a Muslim, Hindu, Buddhist. Everyone has a worldview. Now, he gives us this definition. I think this is going to be important because if we're going to understand that everyone has a worldview, we need to understand what a worldview is. And this is going to help us as we try to understand the positions other people hold, other religions promote, as we seek to evangelize them, as we seek to share the good news of Jesus Christ. It's going to be important that we understand how they view and interpret the world. But first of all, in this episode today, we're going to attempt to understand how Christians, and particularly in a default theist, understand the world around us and how we interpret it. It's based on a series of presuppositions. Now, what's a presupposition? That's usually, it basically means this. It's a belief that you bring to an issue. It's a predetermined belief that you already have that you use when assessing and analyzing the world around you. Again, that's James Sire, S-I-R-E, and the book is entitled The Universe Next Door. I was first introduced to this book, it looks like, back in 2007. So, yes, that's been actually a lot longer than I thought. I've used this book to teach a number of courses on apologetics, and I think it'd be a great resource for you to have as well. So here's his definition. I think this is going to be helpful as we kind of try to think through what's going on around us, because when we analyze the world around us, we're analyzing it through a lens, and other people are looking at the same facts, the same issues, but they're looking at it through a different lens. And it's going to be helpful for us to, first of all, analyze our own lens through which we're interpreting the world, and then try to understand those around us, how they're interpreting the events around the world or issues or beliefs, so that we can be better prepared to defend the faith, to give an answer for the hope that is in us, and also to share the good news with them. Sire provides this definition. Now, there's a number of definitions, but I think this one is a good working definition to understand a worldview, especially when you're hearing people talk about a biblical worldview. What is a biblical worldview? Let's start with the definition of a worldview. A worldview, he says, is a commitment. Now, I've already talked about you already have certain beliefs that you already hold to when you come to an issue. No one walks up to an issue being objective. Everybody, I'm objective. Now, the only being in the universe who is perfectly objective all the time is God. All of us already have predetermined biases based on a number of factors. So worldview is, first of all, a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions. He defines presuppositions as assumptions which may be true, partially true, or entirely false, which we hold. Now, he wants to help you here because you might say, well, I've never even thought about a worldview. So we hold these assumptions. Now, these assumptions could be true, partially true, or false. We hold them sometimes consciously, sometimes subconsciously. Sometimes we hold these assumptions consistently, sometimes we hold them inconsistently. We'll get into some of that as we think about it. But all of these assumptions, this commitment, this orientation of the heart, because we think about it underneath a worldview, that is, underneath your beliefs, is a love. A love for, you fill in the blank, determines how you will then interpret facts around you. Now you say, this is a lot. We're going to unpack all of this and kind of walk through it. And the 7 questions are going to help us as we orient ourselves to our own worldview. And maybe there's some correcting that needs to happen, as our worldview must be subject as Christians to the Bible.
There's not a time zone in which he's not being praised. Listen to me, there is not a moment since the resurrection of Jesus where there's not someone somewhere declaring that Jesus saves.
He says this, So a worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed in a story or in a set of presuppositions which we hold about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. I want to think about a few things here in this definition. First of all, he says it's a commitment. You say, well, I'm not really committed to a position. You might even have a friend or family member. Maybe you're watching, you're an atheist. You say, I'm not committed to anything. You're actually committed to a worldview. In your worldview, you're saying the ultimate reality has nothing to do with God. So right there, I'm showing that the first question, these 7 questions, you're answering. Whether you're an atheist, a theist, a Christian, a Muslim, you are going to have an answer for these 7 basic worldview questions, even though you might not have consciously answered them. I'm going to show you that even subconsciously, you're already oriented in such a way. Now, this orientation, he mentions that it can be through a story, for example, like a meta-narrative, an overarching story. The Bible gives us an overarching story. So if we're going to have a biblical worldview, we're holding to this one story. Now you're going to run into someone, or maybe you're that person, you say, well, no, there's no one story that's the true or overarching story. All stories are equal. That's a worldview. So it can be expressed in a story, or in a series of presuppositions. For example, I believe that there is a God who created everything. I believe that history has a purpose. You see, what I'm doing is I'm laying out a set of presuppositions here, beliefs I bring to every scenario or situation of life. You might say, well, I'm not interested in philosophy or worldviews or theology. You might not be interested in it, but you're practicing it every day. And as Christians, we need to be conscientious of this. That way that we can allow the Scriptures and allow the Holy Spirit to correct our, if you will, the aspects of our worldview that we hold either that are partially true or false. Those should be corrected as we think about this, that we would hold a correct and biblical worldview. I think that definition is great. And by the way, that's why I recommend that you get, I get nothing in return from promoting James Sire's book. However, what I will get out of it is the saints being equipped for the work of the ministry. So this is on page 17, his definition. Whenever I get into a book, I want to find a definition, I'll mark it. In fact, I have it marked in the book on the side, definition, because definitions are important. Someone can run around and say, well, I have a biblical worldview, and then you listen to their statements about different issues, and you quickly realize that maybe they don't consistently hold to a biblical worldview. Maybe you don't, but you want to. Great. Let me walk through these 7 questions. I'm going to give them to you rather quickly. I'm going to come back and then see if we can walk through them a little slower as we think about Christian theism. Now, by the way, theism just simply means a belief in God. From the word theos, where we get that word, it's the Greek word for God. We think of theology, the study of God. Theism is the belief in God. Atheism is the belief that there is no God. So that just comes from the way the Greek language is used. 7 basic questions. Here they are. Number 1, what is prime reality? That is, what is the really real? When you think about this, for some people it's God. Others religions, it's gods. For some, it's just a material universe, nothing else. We'll look at that one. Number 2, by the way, that's question number 1 is important because all the other questions, the answers that you give to the following questions are going to hinge on the way you answer question number 1. Number 2, what is the nature of external reality, that is the world around us? What is the nature of the world around us? So you're going to have some who say that, well, you have a chaotic universe. You might have some who say it's an orderly universe. You might have some communicate that the reality around us is just matter. Some might say it's spirit, depending on whether they emphasize aspects of creation around them. Maybe even some religions would say that, you think about it, in some aspects of Buddhism, you might say that they believe that the external reality around them isn't even real. You say, how would you come to that? Well, they have certain presuppositions about what's ultimate reality. So we'll get into that in a little bit. So, number 1, what's really real? What's the ultimate reality? What is your relationship to the nature of external reality? And that is, what are you looking at around you? So I'm looking at an ordered universe, an ordered cosmos that was created by the ultimate reality, which is God. So I'm already answering 2 of those. Number 3, This is vitally important. Now, most people want to start here, but we don't start here. What is a human being? Now, depending on how you've answered number 1 and really number 2 is going to dictate how you answer number 3. As a Christian, I believe that a human being is the imago Dei. That's Latin for image of God. It's a very popular term. Most people recognize it. We're created in the image of God. So that means that we have dignity, that we should respect humanity, we should care for our fellow humans. They have inherent dignity. Now, if you take a different worldview, for example, like if you believe number 1 is answered by there's a God, but that God doesn't have personality, you don't have a relationship with him, you're not going to answer number 3 the same. You might say, yes, humanity is created in the image of God. However, you may be answering questions concerning human dignity and respect differently. However, you're going to have a number of different views. For example, maybe you take an evolutionary worldview. You'd say, well, human is just evolved from apes. So you're just another animal, just somewhat of an accident through the process of evolution that is just a matter of chance, space, and time. In other words, you're just a bunch of, to quote Jeff Durbin, you're just a bunch of stardust that's collided, and you have no real purpose. By the way, he doesn't believe that. It's just a statement that he uses in some of his debates. Number 4, very important. Sometimes we start here as Christians when we're talking to people about the gospel. I don't think we should start here per se, but we got to get to here. That is, what happens to a person after death? What happens to a person after death? And of course, as you've answered the first 3, you're seeing that there's a certain progression here. Well, if there's no God, then there's no heaven or hell. If you're not creating the image of God and you're just an animal, then maybe you don't have a soul. So you can see how this is very important when we think about how these questions are answered. Number 5, why is it possible to know anything at all? Think about that. Now, you take from one side of the issue, you'd say, well, we've evolved to know things. Well, how can we trust if it was just a process that's not intentional, but accidental? How can we trust our knowledge about evolution? I think that's a great question. Most people don't really think about it. So if we know things, all right, if we have the ability to know things and it's accidental, it's part of evolution, right? How do we know that what we believe about evolution is even true? You say, oh, I know the default. I love these default. Well, scientists have proven evolution. It's a fact. Please stop with that, okay? At this point, it's just so obnoxious when you hear people saying that. You really know when someone starts saying things like that, that they really haven't investigated these issues. Of course, the default is going to be this. Instead of actually walking through and challenging some of those presuppositions, you'll hear like, well, you're a creationist. You just believe the Bible. So just attacking you personally and your beliefs somehow is going to prop up their beliefs. That isn't how this works. So how do you know anything? Well, when you go back, so if you've answered number 1, what is ultimate reality? Just a material universe, just an empty, there's no intelligent designer, no creator. In other words, so there's nothing. It's funny, the universe that came really just, we don't know where it came from if we're atheists. We don't know where it came from. And, it evolved in such a way that it would be known by beings who evolved within it to know that it evolved. That's interesting. It almost feels like the universe was evolving, crying out to be known. Anyway, I digress. I must move on. So if that's how you've answered question number 1, when you get down to question number 5, why is it possible to know anything at all? You just don't have a basis other than just saying it was for survival. So we've developed these infinitely powerful brains, ability to know on levels that it almost cannot be measured. When we think about it, we say, well, you can measure IQ of a genius. Okay, that's only one measurement. You think about the massive amount of information a brain can hold when you think about memories and the information that your brain is processing. I was telling some kids I coach in soccer the other day, I said, you don't realize this, but your brain is doing geometry and physics all the time, instantly, and like a supercomputer. Where do we get that ability? Well, as a Christian, I believe it's because of the Imago Dei. because we're created in the image of God. Number 6, this is important. This is the question of ethics and morals. Question is, how do we know what is right and wrong? Well, again, you go back to an evolutionary worldview, and it's going to be like, well, we evolved these survival skills, and that's how we develop morality. We got to do better. Frankly, we just have to do better. You think about this. As a Christian, I often recognize people attack our beliefs. Well, we are backwoods and ignorant, and we're just Bible thumpers. And yet, you come to questions like this, and the best that someone offers me, the best counterpoint is this: it was a survival mechanism. That's how we developed morality. Okay, that's the best. I don't think so. Because then it leads to questions of, okay, what if then we evolve to commit heinous acts that today that we think are wrong, but 100 years from now we could say, well, no, that's good to do. See, it's shifting sand. Essentially what you have is, you'll see this. More often than not, especially with atheistic worldviews, they want to borrow from the Christian worldview. They want to operate in that realm of order and consistency. And then what they want to do is try to then dismantle a Christian worldview. So, when of course the thing implodes on them, and then you have the likes of Richard Dawkins seeing that the hordes are at the gate, and now he doesn't know what to do. He's out there telling everyone he's a cultural Christian. So how do we know what's right and wrong? Well, because I believe there's an objective lawgiver. If you don't have an objective lawgiver, morality will always be subjective. You will never have a standard set of objective morals if you don't have an unchanging lawgiver. That is, think about this. You have to have a being that is immutable yet personal, in a sense of immutable can't change, but personal, and then understanding the dynamics between intrapersonal relationships. That's the purpose of law. That's why you have to have law to govern relationships. Well, where's that going to come from? It comes from a creator, created us in his image. So, how do we know what's right or wrong? And finally, number 7, which I think is very important, especially as we think about the context that we're living in today, where we're up against now ideologies that want to rewrite history. And of course, as you look at different religions, they're going to have different views of history, and we want to try to understand that, because you don't want to present the gospel and try to build the gospel on a worldview that is antithetical to the gospel. You can't just show up and put a Jesus bumper sticker on another religion and then believe that that person now is a Christian and has a Christian worldview. No. So number 7 is, what is the meaning of human history? What is the meaning of human history? Well, as a Christian, that's going to be easy for me to answer. When God created space and time, He's creating history, and history is a means through which, if you think about this, it's a means, it's the context, it's the arena in which we receive the self-revelation of God. The history is the self-disclosing means that God uses. He uses 2 means. He uses general revelation. We think about creation and history. Special revelation this is interesting because I don't think we think about this a lot. Special revelation is God's interpretation of events within human history. That's why we often call it redemptive history. It's not an exhaustive view of all history, but it is God's divinely inspired interpretation. So it's God's interpretation of history, because God creates history for the purpose of revealing Himself to His creation. And if we didn't have His interpretation of it, we would look around. We could know there's a God. By looking at creation, you can know there's a God. But without special revelation, you can't know that God. And so what happens, if you think about a lot of these religions, you take the special revelation off the table. That is, the being able to know that God. Because without it, you can't. And then you have within general revelation, that is the conscious and creation, the ability to know there's a God. Well, then when you're left to yourself, apart from special revelation, and I mean by special revelation in the Bible, apart from that, you're left to yourself to try to figure out who is this God? And of course, you have this other component of human depravity where we willfully suppress the truths that are plain or obvious about God in his general revelation. So what's the point of human history? Well, another thing is you have to think about this is human history from a Christian perspective is linear. That is, it had a starting point. Now, human history as we know it it has an ultimate purpose. We would call this an eschaton. This is where you get the word eschatology, the study of the purpose or the end, the goal of human history. That whole discussion is morphed into nothing more than sensationalism. Many people don't even talk about eschatology because it's just so loaded with sensationalism. But we have to talk about it from a worldview perspective, from a biblical perspective, push aside all the sensationalism, all the difference of opinions, and recognize that it's important that we define the purpose of human history. We think about within the biblical narrative. The purpose of human history was to reveal God. That's what we're seeing unfold throughout. What then is the ultimate purpose of eschatology is the revelation of God. That's why the last book in the Bible is called Revelation. It's the revelation of Jesus Christ. It is the revealing of Jesus Christ. Certainly, there's a number of different views. That's not the point. We're not getting into this today in this episode, but we see human history moving to this point now. Now, throughout this episode, I've jumped in and while unpacking those questions, I was also giving you a number of different perspectives, but was trying to espouse and defend a Christian worldview. So a Christian worldview is going to say this. Number one, that God is ultimate reality. Number two, the external world around us is a created order that was created to glorify God. Number three, what's a human being? Human beings are created in the image of God to glorify and enjoy God forever. Number four, what happens to us after death? Since we have a soul, we're either going to spend eternity in God's presence, in a covenantal, loving relationship throughout all of eternity, or we are going to spend eternity in hell. I've noticed it's popular now amongst many preachers who don't want to offend. They'll say, well, you'll have a Christless eternity. Well, if you're not a Christian and someone says, well, when you die, you'll just have a Christless eternity, who cares? If you're not a Christian, you say, well, I don't care about that. So that messaging is way off. In other words, it's the old school way of saying it. You either spend eternity in heaven, which is synonymous in God's presence as a member of his family, as a child of God, or you will spend eternity under the wrath and condemnation of God, which we all rightfully deserve, but don't receive because of the Lord Jesus Christ. The Bible is clear. There's therefore now no condemnation for those who are in Christ. So there's two options there. Bottom line, heaven or hell is the simplest way I can say it. We could get into a lot of those details, but that's the simplest way I can say it. Why is it possible to know anything at all? Because God, who, if you think about it, all wisdom, knowledge, he's all-knowing. We're created in his image. We're not all-knowing, but because we're created in the image of an all-knowing being, we can know. Number 6, how do we know what is right and wrong? Because we have an objective lawgiver who has revealed his principles, laws, truths to us. Finally, what is the meaning and purpose of human history? It's to reveal God. That's it, to reveal the person and character of God to his creation, and he would be glorified in it. Wow, we've covered a lot, said a lot. We're going to get into the next episode on worldview analysis. We're going to look at these 7 same questions, but we're going to look at Islam. Why would we do that? Well, first of all, because we want to understand how we can effectively evangelize our neighbors, people in our community, regardless of their religion. We want to understand it so that we can bring the gospel to them and that they might be saved. Well, until the nations are converted, there can be no excuses, absolutely no retreat, and under no circumstances will we surrender. Why? Because Jesus Christ is King. He's not just my King. He's the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords.